Hey gang, welcome back to another video and part 2 of the Coffin build. Now if you remember from part 1, I said that there was an upcoming break in the weather. Well, that ended up being a hurricane, which for us ended up just being a lot of rain. So in the end it wasn't quite the break I was hoping for. But now that we're back to the summer heat, I can get back to finishing this build. So let's get to it. With the foam securely in place, it was time to trim it down into a more manageable shape. And for that I'll be using this hot knife. It works quickly, but you'll want to be sure to wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area because it puts off a lot of fumes. Because of the curvy design of this casket, I'll have to carve the foam away in chunks to get closer to my final shape. This will really help to cut down on the amount of hand carving I'll need to do and minimizes cleanup. Once shaped, I can switch from the hot knife to some more traditional tools, mainly my rasp and a curry comb, which will allow me to really refine the profile. The rasp is really good for any detail areas where a level of precision is needed, while the curry comb is good for removing a lot of material at once. I'll switch back and forth depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. When the shape is close and my shoulder is sore, I'll switch over to the palm sander with some 60 grit sandpaper to bring it into its final shape. You can work your way up through finer grit sandpapers if you need to, but for this project, 60 grit is the only one I'll need. After a quick vacuum of the casket, I'll switch over to my handheld router with a roundover bit to help soften the edges of the foam. This is a fast, easy, and extremely messy way to add details to your foam sculpture that would take forever by hand. If you like making tombstones and monuments, I highly recommend adding this, plus some decorative router bits, to your toolkit. A quick lap with my palm sander to smooth out areas where there's unevenness, and then I can move on to graining. And for that I'll need a wire brush. I'm going to drag the wire brush across the surface of the foam to create a wood grain-like texture. This can take some trial and error, but once you get a feel for how the foam reacts, you'll be off and running. This is the same method as in my Making Foam Look Like Old Wood video, and if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the video description. I tend to alternate between using the wide edge and the narrow edge of the brush, as each has its own look. There's no right or wrong approach, just go with what works for you. Shifting gears, and in an attempt to get out of the sun, I'm moving on to assembling the casket top. This is made from 3 8-inch by 1-inch pieces of foam and a few smaller pieces that act as bracing, and they'll get glued together using the same methods as before. I find that it's helpful having small weights or bamboo skewers to hold your pieces in position during the glue up, since the glue tends to foam as it cures, which can create unwanted gaps. When the glue dried, I flipped the top over and started breaking up the foam into multiple board shapes to match the one in the film, and then I grabbed the wire brush again and got to more wood graining. At this point, I figured I'd do something that didn't involve pink foam for a bit, and grabbed a roll of 3mm craft foam that I cut down to 7 inches wide. I'll be using this to recreate some metal banding that can be seen on the lid of the casket. And to make it look more like metal, I'll be using my heat gun and some tin foil to stamp in some texture to break up the shape. I found that heating the foil and pressing it into the foam makes the process go faster and is a bit more predictable, since reheating areas of the foam causes it to release the texture you've pressed into it. By switching application, I can guarantee the textures I add stay put. You'll also want to make sure to alternate the direction of the stamping to prevent any patterns from forming. The next part of the metal band are these rivets. I'm going to take a page from Dave Lowe's prop making handbook and employ some 3/4 inch googly eyes. All I need to do now is grab some CA glue and get to applying them. Once my rivets are in place, it's time to tie it all together with a bit of rubberized spray. This not only unifies the individual pieces, but gives paint a good surface to adhere to. And speaking of paint, I want this band to look like aged steel, so I grabbed a metallic spray paint and I'll just dust across the surface of the foam. First going left to right at a 45-degree angle, then switching and going right to left at an opposing 45 degrees. This method will give me a mottled look that mimics the finish I'm after, plus it's a quick technique that will look the part. With the major detail pieces out of the way, and after all the shaping, sanding, and wire brushing, here's what the entire casket prop looks like. I'm pleased with how it's come together, and I think any rough areas will be minimized once I get into painting it. And speaking of paint, let's get a base coat on this thing. I purchased a medium gray latex paint for this project, and I've mixed up a custom dark gray by adding some black and brown acrylic paint, plus a bit of water to thin it down, and poured it into my spray gun, and I'll be giving the entire casket a coat of this darker color. And that's when my camera overheated, but you get the idea. With everything base coated, it was time to dry brush my top coat, and for that I'm using a medium gray paint. This step will not only highlight all of the wire brush graining, but will lighten the entire casket to a color that's more in line with what the production had requested. Then it was on to the lid, repeating the same steps as before, making sure to highlight any areas that have a lot of detail. Once the paint had dried, it was finally time to add the fake metal straps to the casket lid. I'll be using a bit of spray adhesive to keep this in place, making sure to apply the adhesive to the foam strap rather than the foam board, and letting it dry until tacky before applying it to the casket lid. If you have any areas that need additional adhesive, it's best to spray it into a cup and brush it onto the foam rather than spraying it in place just in case it reacts with the pink foam board. And with everything painted, dry brushed, and extra details added on, it was time to see it all together. Now there's still a handful of details that I'd like to add, but overall I'm very pleased with how this turned out and can't wait to put it in the hands of production over at Hollywood Graveyard. That's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.